Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all our witnesses for helping us in this important study. My question is to Professor Emon, and thank you, Professor Emon, for pinpointing the structural examples of Islamophobia within the government, particularly in the Ministry of Finance, Public Safety, and the Ministry of Justice. On that line, I'd like you to comment on the government's proposals in the last parliament on online hate. And as Professor, as we've heard from the witnesses, online hate is part of the construct of Islamophobia, part of the foundation of Islamophobia. It's the industry that Mrs. Zine talked about. But I want to know from you whether the old version, which will be retabled at some point, of Bill C-36, goes far enough, in your view, in addressing online Islamophobia and hate speech.
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Omidvar. I'm actually a bit of a fan of yours. I appreciated the report that your committee did on the charitable sector. So, so it's a real pleasure to meet you here. I struggle with online hate. I struggle with it because of its nefariousness and its evanescent quality. And what I struggle with is an inability or unwillingness to go after the platforms, but a willingness to go after the purveyor, the individual accounts. Let's say, for instance, the terrorist hoax provision. We know, for instance, in the case of the New York Times podcast, The Caliphate, there was a gentleman here in Canada who lied about his associations with ISIS. He was prosecuted for a terrorist hoax. And I remember speaking to defense counsel about this particular issue. It's like, why was he prosecuted? Here's one guy who put something up on Instagram or Facebook or whichever social platform. Why is the individual being prosecuted? Now, I understand that his particular posting might contribute to a white supremacist posting and so on and so forth, and contribute to an echo chamber. I'm not entirely certain that we have the tools or the willingness to go after the actual platforms. And so I can't comment effectively on what you've asked for. But what I can tell you, and what I do worry about even more, if I may shift the question, is that even in standard government practices, we often talk about open access when we do research, whether it's the CRA or whether it's Ministry of Finance. We talk about having open access research, which speaks to our democratic commitments. But a lot of this Islamophobic stuff is out there on open access platforms. And so part of the challenge that I'm having as an academic looking at government practices, and again, that's my focus. I'm not a social media analyst. But one of the concerns I have is we don't actually train epistemically to be able to distinguish good information from bad information. We take what we see on a blog and we take it as fact. And I see it over and over and over again across, let's say, in the context of the CRA, the appendices to an administrative fairness letter. It consistently appears in the footnotes. And so my job has been to be a footnote tracker, which is effectively, I'm a glorified footnote tracker. But in doing that, what we see is that we as bureaucrats have internalized a rationality that normalizes Islamophobia as effective policymaking. And until we are able to challenge that, even in the online open access research that we go after, I'm not entirely certain that the online platforms are the only thing that we need to deal with. We need to have better end users. We need to have better readers. And that's something that I can speak to, but I apologize if I can't speak to the specifics of your question in the bill.
Not at all. You've helped me gain some nuance. Thank you, Professor Emon. What you say is actually quite disturbing. If, in fact, our ministries, our systems, our laws, our processes and protocols are so deeply steeped in a way of thinking that lends itself one way or another to Islamophobic results, where should we start in cleaning house? Can you give us some reasonable constructive suggestions here?
Well, so for instance, I'm currently embarking on a study of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist
Mm-hmm.
Financing Act. And I find it fascinating. And one is, how is it that we have, as a government, conscripted the financial sector into the war on terror? And one of the things that I've noticed is, one, we don't have strong consumer protections when it comes to banking. The European Union, for instance, has created guarantees of banking access on the grounds that having access to financial services is important and we can't actually do business without it. Whereas we see individuals losing their banking possibilities and their banking facilities with RBC and HSBC and other banks that do business here. We have a statutory framework that penalizes them and creates moral hazard problems on banks to make sure that they focus on reporting suspicious transactions. Now, FinTrack, when it receives these suspicious transaction reports under the PCMLTFA, it may not do anything with them, but a bank might. And nothing prevents a bank from taking the suspicious transaction and suggesting, maybe I want to de-risk in this particular context relative to this particular consumer. And if you go to the Bank Act, if you go to the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, there's very little forms of redress relative to how banks utilize their national security mandate in this context. So I know that under Federal Budget 2022, there's a desire to rethink financial crimes. We need to recognize that we have enlisted the private sector in the war on terror. There's no accountability publicly. I'm a client of CIBC. I don't know what their metrics are for measuring suspicious transactions. But we do know academically that these algorithms that are used in the world of computer sciences are often embedded with highly racialized algorithms that will flag certain transactions over others. And so if you
Mm.
can imagine what kinds of algorithmic flagging must happen in a way that's also cost effective, are we ever really going to get to white supremacy and the funding of white supremacy when we're looking at a target-rich environment, you might say, right? And with respect to a majority white society. Are the algorithms themselves flagging Somalia, Iran, in certain specific ways that overdetermine certain customers as potentially risky and therefore requiring to be de-risked? Should we include in FinTrack a mandate on equity when it also does its periodic reviews of banks and their methods of analysis? Is equity, egalitarianism, non-discrimination, those are currently not mandates that FinTrack currently has. And then lastly, what kind of access and democratic accountability should banks be held to with respect to disclosures around their metrics of assessment for suspicious transaction? As a consumer, what kinds of protections can I expect from my government with respect to a bank that de-risks me? These are all questions that are central to my concern, not because it's only Muslims that are getting targeted. What I do think is, in this context, Muslims are interesting to think with because thinking about the Muslim at the center of banking offers us a way to think about how robust is our democracy. Where are the limitations on our democracy and where have we over securitized our environment? And it's not just Muslims that are getting debanked, it will be others. But Muslims offer us a really wonderful test case and a case scenario. I say that as an academic, knowing that it's actually quite horrific to be debanked in an environment where we rely on electronic transfers all the time. I hope that that gives you one example and a useful starting point.
It does. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be back to you on further understanding your ideas. Yes.
Thank you.